Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Afrikaans video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 4 of my series on the Neu-Schwerpunkt Rules. In this video I'll be looking at using historically accurate combat strengths for the battalion strength units using these set of rules. Just as a bit of a background, I've created a rather extensive video series on comparing the combat strengths of the battalions of the combatants which fought during World War II, using the Corps Commander points system. In this video, I'll be taking that information and converting the combat strengths into values which make sense for the Neu-Schwerpunkt Rules, or more accurately, the SPI Modern Battles set of rules and all the other board games they've created which uses that as their basis. In my initial conversion of the SPI set of rules into a figure gaming sort of format, I used the system that SPI used in the original Modern Battles set of rules to determine the combat strengths of the various battalion-sized units. This did work and is in the rules, but I did feel that possibly on several levels it was not 100% accurate or correct. The SPI Modern Battles rules did not depict a number of battalion-sized rules that you would find in a division, such as engineers, anti-tank and anti-aircraft battalions. It was also hard to see where the support elements of a regiment or division went. SPI wanted to keep it simple, and it was the correct decision for the board game. But for figure gaming, this may make less sense. It works for figure gaming, but figure gamers tend to want a little bit more detail. The other issue, of course, was the battalion strength accuracy. How accurate are the battalion strengths that I use, or even that SPI uses for their board games? In order to help me determine this, I use the Corps Commander point system. And this point system is primarily based on the real-life combat strengths of vehicles and sections of 10 men. And with some tweaking, I converted them into values which make sense for the SPI Modern Battles game system. I'm not going to cover the tweaks I performed, as after extensive play testing I may require to change them, but I will show the strengths of the various division-size formations which were present, for example in this video, in June to August 1944 to give you an idea of my current findings. For those not familiar with the SPI board game called Modern Battles, I better provide some explanations of the values I'll be using. This shows a standard unit or element if using a figure game version of the rules. It's a battalion. In this case, it's a German Panzerkampfwagen 5 battalion, which is dated June 1944. The first value, in this case 8, represents the attack strength of this battalion-sized unit. The next value, in this case 4, is the unit's defensive strength. The last value is the unit's movement allowance, either in hexes if you're using the board game version, and base widths if you're using the figure game version of the set of rules. Indirect fire elements have some special values. An indirect fire element cannot attack normally, thus there is no attack strength per se. The first value here is its defensive strength. The next value is the movement allowance, either hexes or base widths. The artillery battery in this battalion in this case is motorised, thus its movement rate is 8 hexes or 8 base widths. Now we come to special values. The first value you see here is the bombardment strength of this indirect fire unit. This can be used to support an attack from several hexes distance or base widths distance. The next value is the unit's fire protection strength. This can be used to assist in a defence from many hexes distance or base widths distance away. Finally, we have the fire range in either hexes or base widths that the indirect fire unit can project indirect fire, either bombardment for attack or FPF for defence. Additional special unit types were added to the figure game version of these rules, although some of these ideas do come from other SPI board games which used a similar system to Modern Battles. This shows an anti-tank unit which can attack only at a strength of 0. This is viable in this game system, but will not give you a good result if you choose to do so. The next value is the standard defence strength of this unit. Now we come to the first special value. This is the defensive value used if any of the attackers are armoured. Finally, we have the movement allowance. Again, in this case, it's motorised. Thus, it has a movement allowance of 10 hexes or 10 base widths. The other special unit is the assault gun or combat engineer units. The first value is its standard attack strength. The next value is another special value. This is the attack strength of the unit if it's attacking enemy units which are entrenched, fortified, or are in built-up areas. The next value is the unit's standard defensive strength. The final value is the unit's movement allowance in hexes or in base widths. This is tracked and, well, obviously it's a tracked vehicle, thus it has a movement allowance of 10 hexes or 10 base widths. Let's now drill into the actual formations. This shows a typical full-strength German infantry division in June 1944. Obviously, most divisions of this period were not full-strength. The infantry regimental support could be merged into one of the infantry battalions, which was my original thought, but leaving it as a separate unit also works and could represent a small reserve formation for the regiment. This is what the division would look like if you broke it out by elements. You need 4 different infantry element types: engineer, fusilier, regimental support and infantry. The regimental support could be represented by a heavy weapons element, and the engineer element could be represented by an element with some engineering equipment on it, which is what you would probably expect to find in a typical player's inventory of 6mm figures. I've also decided to use the Corps Commander points value for the rules divided by 250. Thus, this infantry division has a value of 34 points. Now let's move to the Panzer Division. This shows a theoretical full-strength Panzer Division in June 1944. While those on the Western Front possibly were close to full strength, the same could not be said for the Panzer Divisions on the Eastern Front. What I really find quite amazing is how few actual tank elements are used in a Panzer Division. The Reconnaissance Battalion also seems rather powerful here. I am aware some Panzer Divisions created a Kampfgruppen from this formation and a motorised infantry battalion, and I now think I see why they did this. The Panzer Division could also consist, or thus could consist of 3 Kampfgruppen, each consisting of 1 tank or armoured car battalion and 1 infantry battalion. As for the support formations, this could be merged in with the infantry battalions, but I suspect I'll keep them as separate units for the same reason I decided to do that with the infantry divisions. This shows a generic Panzergrenadier division. There were a lot of variations concerning this formation, so this needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. But at 59 points, this is a surprisingly powerful division. The Reconnaissance and Assault Gun Battalion could give this division some real effective offensive capability, supported obviously with the copious amount of motorised infantry. The Germans did attach Panzer battalions to these divisions occasionally. Apart from the actual divisions, we should also consider the corps level formations which may be available to any force mix that you deploy. This shows the typical list of corps level support formations that you may consider. I'm not going to drill down into much detail here, but this shows the typical formations that you may consider to deploy. Thus, for example, the various heavy tank battalions, tank destroyer battalions, and assault gun battalions. I mean, everyone wants to deploy a Tiger II or alternatively a Jagdpanther, and you only can do this if you use the corps level support formations. Let's now move on to the Soviet or Russian forces. This shows a Guards infantry division. The individual battalions were very small by German or Western standards. On the right, what you see are the regimental versions of the various formation, as a large number of 1 strength point infantry battalions may not be viable as a game option. The same applies with the artillery. This is not a very powerful divisional level formation, but considering most of the German infantry divisions were typically under strength, it becomes more of a reasonable match. Let's move on to some larger Russian formations. This shows a Russian tank corps, approximately June 1944. As with the infantry, I've consolidated the infantry battalions into regimental-sized formations, and I've done the same thing with the tank battalions. All of these in battalion level were rather small and becomes more viable if you upgrade it to a regiment. You could deploy the infantry and tanks as individual battalions, but you would end up with a horde of very weak formations, and the game system actually would find it rather difficult to support that because you would need to somehow simulate stacking in order to give yourself any kind of attack strength that can dislodge a German formation. Let's move on to the Mechanized Corps. This shows a generic Mechanized Corps which is equipped with Russian equipment. Most of the Mech Corps used Western tanks and other Western equipment, mainly due to the reliability of Western equipment. The Mechanized Corps, at least in 1944, was not really designed to punch through enemy prepared positions, unless of course it was ad hoc or very weak. It was really designed to follow the tank corps and then form up a strong defensive position when the Germans counterattacked. Thus, reliability of equipment ended up being a lot more important than how strong the equipment was. Nonetheless, putting all that aside, this is a very large formation. As with the tank corps, the tank battalions are consolidated up to regimental strength formations, as are the motorised infantry battalions. As you can see here, even when you do the consolidation, this is a very large formation. Strangely enough, whenever I figure game, I very rarely ever feel a mech corps, mainly because its main method of operating was basically to break through and form a defensive position. Thus, there's not many scenarios where you would actually use a mech corps. This changed in 45, of course, but in 44 that was the case. But nonetheless, this would be a rather interesting divisional-sized formation to field in a game of modern battles or Neu-Schwerpunkt. This shows the typical army-level support formations for the Russians. I've only showed the assault gun formations, and most of these are actually present in the various corps level formation. What I would probably normally deploy would be possibly heavier artillery, but again this depends on the scenario. The tank corps, except in very exceptional circumstances, weren't really designed to break through heavy prepared German positions where you would expect heavy artillery. They were designed to exploit breakthroughs created by the infantry divisions and try and break through ad hoc German positions. So you would normally not have much artillery around. But, that certainly wasn't the case when Zhukov launched his final attack and he had to send in the corps. And in that particular case, he did have heavy artillery support, so you could represent that particular scenario if you so desire. Let's now move on to the US. This shows a US infantry division in June 1944. Just note, the US infantry divisions were fully motorised. The elements or units on the right are attached formations. In most cases, a reconnaissance and tank destroyer battalion would be attached to a division involved in any kind of serious operation. The anti-aircraft battalion was far less common, as was the tank battalion, but if it was involved in an attack, you may find a tank battalion attached. The US divisions were large. Even if we drop the attached tank and AA battalion, the points total is 72 points, which make it as powerful as 2 German infantry divisions. This could be the most powerful division level formation that I'll be showing in this entire video. We'll now move on to the US Armoured Division. In this case, we're showing what's called a light structure. I found it really surprising that this formation had a lower points total than the infantry division, even if we keep the attached units of the infantry divisions down to its basic 2. However, its strength is similar to a German Panzer division at full strength, so it's certainly not an issue. It's just something I found surprising. Now, the US heavy divisions were larger and had a much higher points total, but the bulk of German or American divisions were the light structure. I think there was only 2 heavy structures used during World War II, maybe 3. We'll now move on to the British. This shows a typical British infantry division in June 1944, once again at full strength and, as with the Americans, fully motorised. I'm showing full strength formations because it's easier to do so. If I had the historical formations available to a division at a specific point in time, I could easily use this same methodology to give me a game strength as well, and it's certainly something I may consider in the future. One thing I found rather surprising with the British structure is how so much support formations are placed under divisional control. The result is the motorised infantry battalions are weaker than I would initially expect. If the machine gun and most of the anti-tank guns were distributed among the infantry battalions, they would be much stronger, possibly closer to the American battalions. The anti-tank gun battalion is also outrageously powerful and probably needs to be divided by 3. Once again, most of the anti-tank guns seem to be concentrated at this level, and in real life, most of these guns would be distributed to the infantry battalions. We'll now move on to the British Armoured Division, again June 44. This division is equipped with British tanks, which is, strangely enough, unusual. Most of the armoured divisions were equipped with American tanks. I was rather surprised how this division had so much supporting formations, as well as only consisting of only one armoured brigade. I'll need to go back and check my sources, but this is actually a surprisingly well-balanced formation with an awful lot of very good or high-quality support formations for the tanks and infantry. Just to clarify why I'm creating this video, this experiment, which is what this video is all about, is being used to create a set of cards which will be used to create variable ad hoc scenarios. However, I have found some interesting issues with using historical strengths. I'm basing all these strengths on actual TO&Es. I have all my TO&Es in a database, and using that info and some coding, I can use that with formulas to calculate unit strength. I've discovered some formations are not really suited to conversion in this manner. The British, for example, often place anti-aircraft assets into the anti-tank battalions. In other cases, the battalion-sized formations are huge, as they were designed to be distributed to other formations. I suspect I'll need to look at each case and manually correct it. But besides these minor little issues, automatically creating unit strengths from an actual TO&E, in this particular case I sourced it from Neu-Schwerpunkt, does actually work at creating some interesting historical values for my formation. It gives me a bit more flavour if I pick, let's say, a British versus an American at this particular scale. This shows an example card that I'm creating. The other issue is I'm using official full strengths of the various formations. I suspect it would be better if I use the actual strengths during different campaigns. As I'm using these TO&Es to create divisional size cards, I could have a card for each of the Panzer divisions used at Normandy rather than using a number of identical full strength Panzer division cards. I feel it would add a bit more sizzle to my ad hoc scenarios, and as the TO&Es are all on cards, there should be no downside. You would simply take the card and that would give you all the specs if you wanted to play the game. You wouldn't need to do anything weird like manually keep track of the various elements and their strengths, etc. On a piece of paper, which is a big downside in any kind of set of rules. Of course, the final issue is this methodology would take an awful lot of effort for any specific period. As a result, I'm only going to focus on June-September 44 for now. This still allows the German player to field Tiger 1s and Tiger 2 tanks, as well as most of the tank destroyers. So the German player will generally be happy, although they may not be happy being outnumbered all the time. This also allows me to field all the 4 major nations, Germany, Russian, US and UK. While it's true I'm missing the Italians, few players, apart from myself, ever bother fielding Italian force mixes, so I suspect this will be of minimal issues. While in most part the old SPI board game system of creating units does work, it was interesting to see how the differences between the nationalities and their respective strength differences were manifested when you actually look at real data. The SPI system assumes most supporting formations such as engineers, anti-tank and anti-aircraft were distributed among the frontline combat battalions. The only battalions which mattered were the basic infantry, armour and artillery battalions, with only the reconnaissance battalion being depicted that was directly under the divisional command. SPI did modify this initial modern battle system. Later SPI board games started to include other formations such as engineer battalions, and they had special rules similar to the rules that I've depicted in this video. But the other supporting formations were still being distributed. In many ways, this is probably closer to reality. That is, SPI really probably got it right than having, let's say, individual anti-tank battalion units. However, the anti-tank battalions become invisible when you merge it in with all the other formations, and it becomes more difficult to determine how this impacts the strength of other battalions regardless. No system is perfect. It's simply up to each designer to design the system which suits them and gets them somewhere which simulates reality close enough to be credible. SPI went for the simple, abstract system, and it works very well. However, when you move to figure gaming, you tend to want a little bit more sizzle, because that's what really figure gaming is all about. And so adding anti-tank battalion units and anti-aircraft battalion units becomes more attractive, because after all, I have those figures based on elements and I would like to use them. Look, in retrospect, the conversion of SPI Modern Battles game system into a hexless figure gaming format has been incredibly successful, far beyond anything I originally imagined, and I'm enjoying playing with figures using these set of rules a great deal. And I'm also now considering converting other SPI board games into a figure gaming format. The SPI Victory in the West board games, or the Central Front board game system in particular, both offer greater detail, but of course subsequent greater complexity. I suspect when I've played out the Modern Battles game system, I'll go down the route of converting more complex board games into a figure gaming format, because it works, it's easy, and it gives you a game that is short, gives you a result, and there's movement on the playing area, which is something that is often lacking from a lot of figure gaming set of rules. And so I come to the end of my part 4 of my series on historical strengths for Neu-Schwerpunkt Rules. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.